Hello and welcome to the fourth instalment of Thinking in Fusion, a video manual for Clickteam Fusion 2.5, both the full edition and the free edition. A couple of sessions ago we looked at player movement. Now we'll be looking at enemy movement, but this can also be applied to NPCs, non-playable characters, or even objects that are in the background of your game. In the evolving world of gaming, enemies and the way they behave has slowly been improving and progressing, and their coding is much more complex. We'll look at 3 different levels of complexity that you can add to your games in Clickteam Fusion. So first of all, we'll look at fixed movement. This is movement that you set as the programmer. Then we'll move on to random movement, where each time you play the game, the enemy will move slightly differently due to the randomness. And then, in the more advanced section of this video, we'll look at giving your enemies intellect, getting them to calculate what's happening around them and making choices based off that. This gives the effect that the enemies are making their own choices, that they have artificial intelligence, but it's just us being clever as a programmer. Just a disclaimer, I'll be showing you what I feel is the best way to create enemy movement. There'll be lots of other tutorials, lots of other videos online, so do check them out. I'm just showing you one way. But let's get started with fixed movement. The path movement. Path is putting a set of waypoints down for an object to follow. These points are called nodes, and they're represented by a square. The route to the node can have its own speed, and each node can have a pause attached, so the object can wait at that node for a certain amount of time before moving to the next one. Let's create a basic path movement. In the frame editor, we'll add a new active object. And it's only active objects that can have these movements. In the properties toolbar, we'll go to the movement options and change the type to path. Under edit movement, click the edit button. Then you'll get the path movement setup window. The first icon is for new line. Selecting this and then clicking on the screen will create a new node to be added to the current path. If we try that movement, we'll see that the object moves from the first node to the second node, at the default speed being 50. We can drag a selection box around the line to select it. Now we can adjust the speed. I'm going to make it much slower and try the movement again. Be aware that if you have a game with a large play area, that you might not be able to see the movement when you try it. So you can just run the application and watch the movement then. By selecting new line again, we'll add a new node from the node that's selected. This means you can make a new line between 2 previous nodes. If you reposition the first node, that will reposition the object in the frame. Nodes will flash when selected, and also the line from that node. This flashing line is telling you which part of the path the speed slider will affect. There is a shortcut. Rather than selecting new line each time, we can just use the right click. That will place a node and then allow us to place another node by right clicking again, or left clicking to place a final node. The new line option creates quite angular movement. For a smoother path movement, you can use the tool Tape Mouse. When selected, if we hold down the mouse left button and drag around the screen, we will trace out a path. The slower we trace out the path, the more nodes added and the smoother the motion will be. Having 2 nodes close to each other or far away from each other won't mean they have a different speed. Again, we'll have to select that area either by dragging and selecting over the nodes or selecting a node individually to change its speed. The next option is to set a pause. So if you choose your node, then choose set a pause, you can enter a delay in either seconds or hundredths of seconds. The next icon can be turned on or off. It's called loop the movement. If on, it means when the object reaches the end of its path, it will repeat the path. It won't return to the beginning, it will just repeat that motion again and again. Whenever it finishes, it will start that path movement and trace out that shape you drew again. The next icon, reverse at end, means when on, at the point of reaching the end of the path, the object will travel back to the beginning of the path. Combining loop the movement and reverse at end will mean that your object travels to the end, reverses back to the beginning, and then does it all over again, forever. If you don't want the object to travel back to the beginning to start again, you can turn on reposition object at end, which means that when it gets to the end of the path, it will just teleport back to its original coordinates. Finally, you have a choice of colour, so you can change the line and node colour. There are some hidden options. If you right-click on a node, you can insert a line, you can taper the mouse, record mouse, set pause, set speed, but you can also set the name. Naming nodes is useful because that can then be used in the event editor to trigger an event when your object reaches a node. It can be also used to reposition an object back to a node. We'll revisit path movement in a little bit when we visit random movement, because there's two techniques you can use to make path movement less predictable. We're going to be looking at fixed movement, but using the bouncing ball movement. By avoiding the action bounce, which we'll look at in the next section, you can actually use bouncing ball movement for so much more, and we'll expand on that later. Here's a common example where I'll use bouncing ball movement in a platform game. When you have enemies travelling back and forth across a platform, defending an area, you could use path movement. Now, because a movement is shared between all instances of that object, you would have to clone your object and make a new path movement for the different lengths of platforms the enemy will be on. If you don't, they'll all move exactly the same way at the same time, and it will only work if they have the same length of platform to travel on. So by adding an object, selecting bouncing ball movement, we can choose an initial direction to guarantee the object will be going the correct direction. By selecting the numbers next to initial direction, we can set the directions that it chooses from. So by ticking 0, which is to the right, and 16 to the left, it will make a random choice at the beginning which direction it will go. It will only move left or right when it starts. Now we can set a speed. I'm going to lower it down to 15 to allow my character a chance. That's all I'm going to do. In the properties toolbar, I'll need one more object before I add my event in. So it's going to be another active object, and I'm just going to call this enemy reverse. It doesn't matter what it looks like because I'm actually going to turn off in the properties toolbar under display options visible at start. It'll be invisible to the user. Then I'm going to drag in another instance of the enemy reverse and place it the other side of the enemy to set some boundaries. In the event editor, I'm going to go to new condition, enemy, collision with another object, enemy reverse, and then add an action for the enemy. Right clicking under the enemy, I'm going to choose direction, select direction, and we'll calculate the direction. That 1 + 1. We know our enemy starts either going 0 to the right or 16 to the left. So we'll get its current direction by clicking on the enemy, and it's actually under animation. So under animation, current direction value. Now remember our circle is from 0 to 31, 32 being a full revolution. To change 0 to 16, we will just add 16. But if it's 16 and we add 16, it will go to 32, which is the same as flipping the direction by 180 if it was an angle. So by adding 16 or minusing 16, we reverse the direction and we get the effect we want. So here it is running. So because the bouncing ball doesn't bounce at any point, we know it'll only be travelling in a straight line back and forth. I just wanted to highlight about movement extensions. Underneath all of the non-physical movements and physical movements, there's movement extensions, and here's just 3 of them. Circular allows something to orbit, so you choose a position on screen with the X and Y coordinates, and it just rotates around there at a speed. Invaders are like the classic Space Invaders that track left or right until they hit the wall and then they drop down. And then pinball movement is sort of a hybrid between bouncing ball movement and physics bouncing ball movement, but very limited. So it acts like there's gravity for a bouncing ball to give it an effect that it's been hit. Right, let's get back to it. Bouncing ball movement. Bouncing ball movement. Bouncing ball movement. Bouncing ball movement. As I said in the previous section, bouncing ball movement is a great movement to give to your enemies. It allows you to do a whole host of things from the event editor. You can set speed, you can set deceleration, you can check for collisions, for overlapping, and use stop, you can use bounce, loads of useful features. So let's set up the most basic of bouncing ball movements. In the frame editor, we'll add an active object, we'll change its movement type to a bouncing ball, and we'll say, in the event editor, a new condition, on that object, position, test position of active, and if it tries to leave the frame area on the top, the right, the bottom, or the left, we'll trigger this condition. Press OK. We'll right click underneath the active and say movement bounce. For this example I haven't named my active, but do name your actives when making a game. It makes it so much easier. Then if we test the application, we can watch the active object bounce around the screen. And if we restart it, it starts in a random direction, which is probably different to before, and it will bounce in a different way. Now we can control the randomness of the bounces in the properties toolbar for the active object. So we close our test application. We can set the amount of angles that it's allowed to bounce at, so we can change that from the full 32 down to 16 or 8. We can then change the randomizer and the security. Randomizer increases the amount of randomness to the bounce. A mathematically predictable bounce will be 0. Increasing the randomizer allows each bounce to be more unpredictable, the higher the number. Sometimes a bouncing ball may hit a wall dead on and bounce off dead on and get stuck in a bouncing loop. So security allows you to add a random bounce after a certain number of similar bounces. So decreasing the security will mean that you're less likely to be stuck in an infinite bouncing loop. It's not just the edges of the screen that you can apply a condition to for a bounce. You could create a backdrop object that's an obstacle, that's the wall, and you can say that when the active object collides with the backdrop, it bounces. And you can do it with actives as well. You could add in an active object. Maybe this is a door in your game that later needs to be destroyed. And you can say that when the active object hits into the door, it bounces. You can also use this effect for creating a zone, a barrier, to fence in your active object into an area of the screen. You can create an active object that will be a barrier. In its properties, in its display, you can uncheck visible at start. Then in the event editor, you have the same condition that if the active collides with that barrier, that it bounces, holding it within an area that the P1 character can travel through and that the player themselves can't see. Now we'll look at adding a bit of randomness into path movement. The path movement is a fixed shape, but there's two things that we can do to make it a bit more random. When starting a game with objects on the same path, it all seems very basic, very mechanical, very dull. So what we can do is we can add a randomness in that when triggered reverses the path movement. This will only work for paths that have loop the movement and reverser end already turned on. Otherwise, paths will go out of sync. What we can do is we can use an alt-rel value in the properties toolbar for the enemy. We'll call this alt-rel value reverse. Then in the event editor, new condition, the timer, every 0.02 of a second. We can set the enemy's alt-rel value to be a random number. We'll set it to random 100. So 50 times a second, it will be setting the counter to a number between 0 and 99. That's how the random function works. It does up to that number from 0. So we'll add a new condition to be triggered for that. For the enemy, we'll compare to one of the alt-rel values. When reverse is equal to 1, then we'll run these actions. So we'll apply 2 actions for the enemy. So right-clicking under the enemy, we'll choose movement and the action reverse. which means that it will go the opposite direction. And then we'll right click on the same box to add another action to the enemy. For its alterable values, we'll set that reverse value back to 0, so it doesn't keep on triggering this condition. Now if we test our application, all the objects will start at the beginning of the path and follow the same movement, but over time they'll go out of sync. This is why I quite favour the fixed bouncing ball movement, where you use another active object to reverse movement, because that way you can position your object anywhere on its route. But a very useful way to use path movement for enemies is for the boss battles. Quite often, when you have a boss fight, the boss might have a certain attack cycle. So they have a certain thing that they do in a certain way, and they choose from a list. By using multiple movements, we can give an object multiple paths. So for this boss character, I've given it 4 different path movements. I've named the different path movements just to help me remember what's happening. I've made sure that each path movement doesn't have a loop the movement, but does have reposition object at end. This way I can have a condition under the boss movement, path movement, has the boss reached the end of its path. Then for the action for that, if I right click under the boss, I can go to movement, multiple movements, select a movement, and this is where I can use a calculation. I have 4 path movements starting at 0, going up to 3, so I'm going to say random 4. That way it will choose 0, 1, 2 or 3 and press OK. This way each path movement is predictable, but we never know which one it will choose. As the user, we have to work that out and get our player character to dodge accordingly. So faking this AI, we're going to use alterable values. Remember back to bouncing ball movements earlier? Bouncing ball movements. Bouncing ball movement. Bouncing ball movement. We're going to have this enemy character that we're going to use for our fake AI set up as bouncing ball movement, but with a deceleration. Adding a deceleration here will mean that the character automatically comes to a stop. And that's exactly what we want, for them to sort of wander around. I find this is the most simple way to do it, but you could also use physics and replace when we set the movements to applying an impulse. That gets quite tricky, so I'm just going to stick to the basics for now. Alterable values, as we said before, check back in the previous video, is a way to store values within each active object so that each active object can have its own action applied. Only those active objects that match the condition relating to your alterable value. A common one might be when the alterable value of health equals 0, then destroy, as shown in the previous video. So here's a list of alterable values set up. In the newer versions of Clickteam Fusion, you can drag and move about alterable values, but it's always nice if you get the order right first time. I would always put in health as the top alterable value for any enemy or non-playable character. And below I've set up different values. We have chances and calculations. We've got the chance to walk, calc to walk, chance to dash, calc to dash, chance to change direction, calc to change direction, chance to look at player, calc to look at player, chance to look away, and calc to look away. And you can see that all of these are set up so that they have a chance and then a calculation. And this is the relationship between them. The relationship between the chance alterable values and the calc work like this. The chance are the ones that we set as the programmer. The calc is a value that Fusion will generate. Then we'll have a condition that will trigger on if the calc to walk or dash or look away is equal to 1, then we have an action that relates to it. So if calc to walk equals 1, then we'll set the movement of the character to a slow movement speed. So we will set an event that will happen every 200ths of a second or however often you like, that will generate the calc to walk off the chance to walk. We'll just set it to be a random range between 0 and whatever the chance to is. So, for example, if the chance to walk is 100, it would pick a number between 0 and 100. There'll be a 1 in 101 chance that it would think of the number 1. And if it does, then we'll have the condition here. Calc of walk equals 1. We'll set it to move at a slow speed. Movement, set speed to be slow. So maybe sort of 8 or 6 or whatever suits your game. Stop this condition from happening. We can reset the calc of walk back to 0. And it's a good idea to test things out independently of each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to run it just with the walking. So if we set it to the lowest number that will work, which is 1, then 50% of the time it will be choosing 1. So it'll be walking constantly. The higher the number goes, the less likely it is to happen. So if we set it to the 100, the movement is much less often. If we close that and go back into the event editor, let's do the calc of dash equals 1. Now this time, we're going to set the movement, set the speed to be something larger. Maybe 20, maybe 30. Let's set it to 30. And don't forget to add in that we'll set the optimal value, calc of dash, back to 0 to stop it triggering more than once. And let's change the chance of dash to be not very often. So maybe 300, which would be roughly every 6 seconds. Now we'll look later at how we can make that dash more aggressive, so we'll come back to that. Now for the chance for it to change direction. When that equals 1, under the enemy, we'll right click, direction, select direction, and we'll use this button in the bottom left to select all the directions. Leaving it with selected all the arrows there, it will randomly choose a direction out of the 32 available for bouncing ball movement. And to stop it flitting about with changing direction, we'll right click and we'll set the calc to change direction back to 0. So that it only runs this condition once for every time it equals 1. Now if we test our application, we won't really see it. That's because there's no artwork for a different direction. So you have two choices. You could either go close the test application, go into the frame editor, right click and edit, or select it and press enter, and go into the picture editor and draw something to represent the direction it's facing, so to the right. Slide the slider bar at the bottom up to allow 32 directions. Right click on the direction that's filled in and create rotated directions. We'll be looking at these direction images and animation options in the next video when we're going to be looking at artwork and animations, and press OK. Now when we run our application, if we've got a low number, it will change direction really regularly. So you'll see it flit about into different directions. Alternatively, if you make the chance to walk 1, so it will walk all the time, then you can see it change direction. And that will give you a much better idea of how often you want it to change direction. Let's close the test application and go on to the other ultra values. The next thing, the calc of looking at the player. So for the calc to look at, when that's equal to 1, we'll right click on our enemy, direction, look in direction of P1. As simple as that. Now we could add a bit of inaccuracy in there. Just by adding an extra action, we can right click and go direction, select direction, use a calculation, and we can get its current direction, which in the expression editor, if you choose the enemy, click on animation and get the current direction value. So you could just add a random range between -3 and +3, then that'll give you a slight inaccuracy. The lower the numbers, or the closer to 0 the numbers, the more accurate it will be. So let's test that out. If we set the chance to look at player to the lowest, to 1, then it will constantly be looking at us. And if it was constantly moving and constantly looking at us, then it would be chasing us. And that's the mindset you need to get into, how these relate to each other. Let's close that, go back to the event editor, And the calc to look away, when that is 1, what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing as looking at the player. So we're going to go into direction, look in direction of P1. Rather than add a little inaccuracy, we're going to reverse it. So it's that adding 16 or minus 16 because there's 32 directions, as we showed earlier. So direction, select direction, use a calculation, get that characters at click animation, and we'll get its current direction value. But again, if you wanted to make it slightly inaccurate, you don't need to add 16. You could add a random range between sort of 14 and 18 or something similar to that. Now, thinking about it like a stat sheet of like you might do in Top Trumps or with Pokemon or something similar like that, you can hone in all these different chance values for different enemies to give them different ways of behaving. So if you were to clone your enemy or your NPC, whatever you're applying this to, you can change the default for the alterable values, and that will give you a variation and have them behave differently to the other variation that you cloned them from. Now you would then have to go through and add in all of those conditions and actions again for that different active object. And that's because we haven't yet covered qualifier groups in 2 videos' time. So this session, I'm just going to hold back from that just so that we can go a little bit deeper into adding some more fake AI and some data we can give the enemy or your NPC so that it can make a choice about what to do. And I also said we can make the dash a little bit more aggressive. So in terms of the calc to dash, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the actions for that. So you've got the set speed, but I'm also going to set direction, and I can get it to look in the direction of the player. So direction, look in direction of P1. Again, you could add a random range to make it more inaccurate, depending on what type of characteristic you want. Now, up until now, our AI has been based on just a randomness, and in that feature of every 200ths of a second, we're just setting alterable values to be random. So we need to smarten it up, and the way we do that is we can use data from what's happening in the game to influence the enemies or the NPCs. So let's start off with something very basic that we already have, a health counter. I programmed in that the player can launch a fireball, and if it hits the bad guy, it gets destroyed, and the enemy has 1 subtracted from their alterable value of health. I've set it up so that by default, they have a health of 3, and that if their health gets to 0 or below, they're destroyed. Now as the game's designer, you get to have influence on how that enemy, that NPC or that object will change its behaviour depending on what's happening to it. And that's done quite simply by us adjusting the chance during the gameplay. For this example, I'm going to say the more the enemy gets hit by the fireball, the more chance of looking away gets closer to 1, meaning it's more likely. And with maths, the way that I'm going to do that, I'm just going to lower the number down by dividing it by a whole number or timesing it by a fraction. So I'm going to go to the enemy, alterable values, and I'm going to set the chance to look away, and I'm going to get that from the enemy itself, whatever it currently is. So I'll click on the expression editor at the bottom, I'll get the enemy, get the alterable values, the chance to look away, and I'll times that by 0.5. Now, our random range picks between a number of 0 and whatever the chance is. To make things neater, I don't want the chance to end up being a decimal or a floating point number or a fraction. I want it to be a whole number. So there's a mathematical feature called ceiling, and that means to round up. It's written as ceil, C-E-I-L. So if we put that at the beginning and put everything else in brackets, it will round up the answer. So if you end up with 0.5, it will round it up to 1. Even if you get 0.1, it will round it up to 1. It will round it up to the next whole number. So we'll never ever get below 1. This principle of then changing our chance to walk or chance to dash or look at player by timesing it to get it to be a bigger number or dividing it to get it to be a lower number can allow us to affect the behavior of this character in game. So what other data can we use? Proximity is how close something is. So I'm going to add an alterable value into our enemy called proximity. I could add a new condition in under special and always, because that would be useful, but I don't need to. We've already got the calculate every 0.02 of a second, and I like to keep everything in the same place, so there's not too many events in our event editor to look through. Rather than set it to a random number, this proximity is going to be set to a precise number. So we're going to go and right click on the enemy under that condition. Going to go to alterable values, set. From the drop down, choose proximity. In the expression editor, we're going to use a calculation from the enemy. So click on the enemy and position and distance with a point. Now it wants an X coordinate and a Y coordinate. These will be of the player. So it'll measure from the enemy to this point. If we click on the player and choose position, X coordinate, and then if we use the tab button on the keyboard, or if you make sure you select everything, including the triangular brackets, we're going to get the Y coordinate from the player. So click on the player, position, Y coordinate. And that's it. And that'll be a valid expression. You shouldn't have a 0 in there or any numbers at the beginning. So if we run our game, we can have a look at the debug window, and I can bring up our enemy and we can see how many pixels it is away from the player. And that's working fine. The closer I go, the lower the number gets. So we'll close the test application. So in this example, we're going to keep this kind of characteristic of being scared, but we're going to say that if the player gets close to the enemy, then it's going to walk away. Now that we've tested that's working, we're going to add an event in, and we're going to put it in a specific position. This event needs to happen after the calcs have become randomly generated. So after that condition that we've just looked at, we're going to right click on the number and insert an event. Now we can add a new condition, and we can have a look at the enemy from its alterable value compared to one of the alterable values, and we'll get proximity from down the list. If it's lower or equal to 200 pixels, press OK. What we're going to do is we're going to use the fact that we know that when calc equals 1, it triggers the action. So on the enemy, we're going to right click and alterable values, and we're going to set the calc to look away. We'll set that to 1. We'll also then make it move. So we'll right click on the same square under the enemy on that condition and choose the calc to walk. We'll set that to 1. Knowing that when the calc to walk, it moves, and we know that when it's the calc to look away is 1, it will not face us. So now we can run around chasing the enemies and they can start walking away from us. But you could do the opposite. You can make it the calc to look at the player to be 1, or the calc to dash to 1. So if you get too close, they'll leap at you. But to stop the proximity triggering straight away, set the default proximity alterable value to a high number. Otherwise it'll start at 0, triggering the condition immediately. So I want to make this clear. This is quite important. The AI, the fake AI that we're generating, is predictable. Currently we know that if the proximity gets low enough, they'll respond a certain way. So to make it less predictable, rather than setting the calc of to be 1, you can set it to a random range that's lower than it is normally. So if the chance of doing something is 100, and for example, the proximity condition is triggered, rather than set it to 1, if we set it to random 10, it just makes it 10 times more likely that they'll respond if we're closer to them than further away, rather than it being guaranteed by us just setting it to 1. Here's another way of using things to make your enemies seem intelligent. We're going to call this fake hearing. We're going to add an active object into our game. I'm going to label it as dry leaves because they make a noise when you stand on them. I'm also going to add alterable value for P1. I'm going to call this noise made. Now in the event editor, so I'm going to add a new condition, P1, collision with dry leaves. And under P1, not under the enemy, but under P1, I'm going to ultra values, I'm going to set the noise made to be a distance, to be a range, sort of a radius of how much noise it's made. So if it was 50, it means the enemies who hear it would have to be within 50. So that's quite low. So I'm going to set it to 200. And now for the condition for when the enemies sort of hear it, if they're within that range. So new condition for the enemy, compared to one of the ultra values, if the proximity value from earlier is lower or equal to, and from the expression editor get P1s, ultra values, the noise made, press OK. Then at this point, we'll trigger them to dash at you. So under the enemy, we'll right click and go to calc of dash and make sure that's equal to 1. It's really important, the ordering. This needs to be done after the calc of dash is set to a random number and before the calc of dash is checked to see if it's equal to 1. So make sure you can pull on the number and drag it to the right position. Then we walk on the dry leaves and we go close, we'll get chased. The only thing we need to do is we need to reset that. And that position is important too. That needs to happen after we've checked for dash. We can make a new condition. Under special, always, under P1, ultra values, and we'll set the noise made back to 0. Then you could add other active objects in your game which have a different amount of noise made. Now for the AI that you would expect in most games, sight. I'm just going to show you a very basic example. There's other ones on the internet that you'll find, but we're going to use the launching of an object. In 2 videos time, where we talk about qualifiers, groups and loops, we're going to hone this in and make it so that you can work with multiple different enemies at the same time. This will only work with one enemy at a time. What we'll do is we'll make an active object, which is the sight. It's an invisible sense, which the player can't see, and so as the programmer, I like to set those objects to be a luminous colour to distinguish them. On my timer event, every 200ths of a second, or you could add in another always event, I'm going to get the enemy to launch an object and launch the sight in direction of P1. Now I'm going to have a new condition that if the sight collides with P1, under the enemy, under ultra values, I'm going to set dash to 1. So it should set the speed and look at the player with the current code. And as always, this is important that this condition is done after the calcs are randomly generated and before the calcs are checked. I'm going to put it just before the calc of dash equals 1. So if we run our application, you can see the beam of sight coming at me. And if it collides with P1, then the enemy chases me. And let's add some walls in. So I'm going to add in some active objects called rocks. And I'm going to add a backdrop object called wall. Now, in the event editor, I'm just going to add in 2 conditions now. With the sight collides with the rock, it gets destroyed. The sight gets destroyed, so it can't travel through the rock. And the same for if the sight collides with backdrop, that it gets destroyed. If you're using backdrop objects, properties window, runtime options, the obstacle type is set as obstacle, so that a collision can be detected. There we go. So now I can use things to protect me. Now be aware, launched objects don't follow all of the properties set up in the properties window. So unchecking visible at start won't make it invisible. But we can use under display options, blend coefficient, set it to 255 to make it transparent. Then I'll make it invisible to the player, but also to us as a programmer. So you might want to turn off create at start as well. Using this sight can also be a great way to trigger the enemy launching an object at the player. So if we add a new active object in, this will be the thing that the enemy fires. We'll call it enemy fire. Make it smaller. I'll position it off screen so it's out of the way. New condition that if the sight collides with another object, P1, it will run this condition, but that's too often. So I'm going to right click on the words and insert a special condition, X chances out of Y, 1, out of 10. Type that in, and that means that only 1 on average of every 10 sight will trigger this. Under the enemy, launch an object, enemy fire. And we're going to launch it in the direction of P1. Press OK. Now, as you can see, that the enemy now isn't shooting all the time, but is far too accurate. Because when the sight collides with P1, it triggers dash, and dash looks directly at us, under the enemy, under the dash, I'm going to make the dash more inaccurate, as we did before, with plus or mining to its current direction. Then, for our firing rule, I'm not going to launch it in the direction of P1, but I'm going to launch it in the direction that the enemy's facing, the new inaccuracy. Adding back some more randomness. So there we go. Looking at some basic enemy movement, some NPC movement, and ways you can make things seem like they have intelligence, and add some difficulty in your game that isn't just ordered on path movement and isn't completely random just with bouncing ball. And timed event, qualifier, groups and loops, which will explain more of how you can get this to work in 2 videos' time. Next time we'll see you for artwork and animations. Take care. See you then.